that I can call you doctor. Congratulations for that, by the way. And thank you, first of all, thank you for giving me the space and the opportunity to share with your classroom this interesting conversation. I'm very happy to be able to share kind of thoughts, experiences with you guys. I know we have people from with different backgrounds in a very diverse group of young professionals. So happy to interact with you. Professor Fernandez asked me to first talk a little bit, and I will speak around 15 to 20 minutes about some superficial thoughts, because we were very ambitious when defining the focus of this conversation. Tell you a little bit more about that later, but I will start speaking, but then I would love for you guys to ask questions, comments, share ideas, etc., your perspectives in the second 20 minutes of the class. Professor, one question for you. Like we have until 10, until like we have 34 minutes now, right? See?
Yeah, more or less, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
whatever you prefer.
Perfect. Okay.
Around 20 and 20.
Perfect. That sounds good. So again, thank you for the introduction. I'm Deputy Director for Strategic Development in the Atlantic Council. And beyond what Professor Fernandez shared, I have also been working, and this is relevant for this conversation. First, on connecting private and public interest, the private sector with the public sector, and to promote U.S. Latin America relations and constructive, exchanges, to promote, again, kind of Western values of democracy within Latin America and the Caribbean, with a focus on the transatlantic community, connections with Europe, concretely with Spain. We're going to talk a little bit about that as well. But I also am in charge of the congressional relations of our centers. As we are the Latin America Center, we want to influence politics and policy. We want to convince policymakers, we want to convince Congress that a best course of action, for example, to mitigate China's presence in the region is X, Y, and Z. We work constantly with lawmakers and with decision makers to help inform the way they decide. But we're going to talk a little bit about this, and now we have a limited capacity to influence them. And what I have seen through my time working with these stakeholders is that politics, domestic politics, public perception in small groups with diverse realities are the most forceful influence that they receive day to day. So when Professor Fernandez asked me to connect with you with this theme, I was in New York in the UN General Assembly. We hosted an event. One of the things we do at the Latin America Center in the Atlantic Council is we always want to elevate Latin America in the global context. We want to convince Europe, we want to convince the US, we want to convince Asia that they should engage with Latin America, that Latin American issues are of global nature and we need to work together. And there are like many opportunities for engagement, for economic growth, for different spaces. So one way to do that is to elevate the role of Latin America in the UN General Assembly in New York. So we went there and we hosted an event with Special Representative Josep Borrell from the European Parliament, the European Union, President of Guatemala, Jan Matei, representation of the US government, Foreign Minister of Ukraine, and private sector, talking about the implications for Latin America of the Russia-Ukraine war, the disruption of the supply chain, the challenges on energy, and what does that mean for Latin America, the impacts, but also, again, the opportunities for the transatlantic community, Europe and the US, to connect, to leverage the opportunity, this global challenge, this geostrategic challenge, to improve, to strengthen relations with Latin America. But again, being in New York, we were trying to think, how can we connect, how we can explain and analyze the upcoming midterm elections that will shape somehow the US foreign policy moving forward. It could shape the U.S. foreign policy moving forward, and how Latin America plays a role here, and how can be Latin America influenced by that as well. So let's first start with the obvious, right? Let's take a step back. We are right now in a crazy world. That's a reality. We are now facing so many challenges that the world systems are still like trying to run and keep up with the changes, adapting to this rapidly changing environment. So it's a crazy world. I mean, governments, private sector, NGOs, we are all struggling to keep up, to adapt to this. And I'm talking about supply chain disruption with the COVID-19, for example. I mean, let's try to think about what's the implications of people having to be isolated at home, not going out, the uncertainty that represents, and that of course disrupted the supply chain. And this super elegant word, what is the meaning of this for human beings, for the reality of human beings? This we Venezuelans understand this very well, is lack of food, lack of medicine, thinking about vaccines, and at that point, lack of capacity to distribute vaccines to the people, cold chains. We're talking about many things that affect, that can threaten our existence as race, right? So but then looking at other topics that have erupted rapidly and aggressively, and here I have the opportunity to work with Professor Fernandez a lot on this space, is the digital space, right? Let's again think for a single second, like the changes that we have seen in the digital space in the last 4 years, right? Let's only think about the growth of e-commerce, social media, gaming. Let's think about 30% more internet consumption in the last 4 years. Those are not small numbers. But if we continue thinking and we go to the innovation front, we're talking now about the metaverse, we're talking about NFTs, right? So all those things are happening in the world. But as all these changes and transformations of the system happen historically, these is creating also challenges for humanity, for us, like for the system. And we saw how digital inclusion right now is such an important topic globally, because these changes have I would say deepened the inequality that we live right now in the world, and digital inclusion is one of them. But then if we continue thinking about the global disruptions that we have seen in the last years, we can think about disinformation and how disinformation played a huge role in the pandemic, how governments managed the pandemic, how the private sector managed the information around vaccines, etc. And all these challenges and changes happening at the same time are creating something that we need to recognize. We need to start by recognizing that the system, the rule-based international system, and the democratic system, democracy, is being challenged right now. Right? There is a huge crisis, like we're talking, and I know Professor Fernandez likes this subject, this area, is the post-truth. In a post-truth world, we're questioning everything. We don't believe anything anymore. We don't believe in institutions anymore. Traditional media, and we're going to talk a little bit about populism and how that affects those institutions that liberal democracy had as pillars of democracy, are being right now questioned. But this also created a space for autocratic governments to deepen their control over people. And the sum of these, I will end the conversation about how the COVID-19 affected the reality that we face right now. I would say, and this will be very relevant for the conversation about midterms, about politics, is about the rise of populism globally. And populism is not about, as we all know right now, it's not about being from the right-leaning, left-leaning. It's not about your ideology. It's about how you approach, again, democracy, how you approach respect for democratic institutions. And I can say, three kind of transversal behaviors that we have seen across the globe being exacerbated is first, populist leaders, again, from both ideologies, from many ideologies that consistently undermine formal institutions such as courts, legislatures. I know this class is about also the systems, presidential systems and parliamentary systems. So this is embedded in every one of these systems, and all these systems are vulnerable to these practices, right? And always in this process of undermining institutions, we see how the majority rule over the minority, but I would say undermining some of rights that for the minority, right? And second point, I superficially covered this before, but is attacking the independence press. That is an institution, I would say, in our country. We had an independent outlet called Cuarto Poder, the fourth power of society. That is the independent media, independent press. Populist leader questioned the loyalty of the free press and political opposition instead of to try to undermine its legitimacy. And I mean, we can see that in El Salvador right now, we can see that in Brazil, but also we can see that in the US, in Europe, we can see that in Venezuela. I mean, this is all over the world. And third, and I think this is also important for now, and thinking about the impacts of COVID and the impact of the Russia war, that is migration, connected with migration and with the future, like how is the future of migration look like in the midst of all this, is the populist leader want to, of course, always represent the people. And by doing so, you have to define what people is, and also by consequence, you differentiate from other groups. And that means you attack those who are different to the group, to the people you are representing. And we see this very clearly in the way the populist leaders are handling migration and the policies toward migration. So those three topics are important, again, to understand what are the main challenges that the society, that we as a society, as a global world, we are living. And again, in parallel, we see, we were almost done with COVID, almost done. And then when we thought that, okay, this was over, then Russia decided to invade Ukraine for the second time. I won't go into the history of this conflict, but this also is creating a lot of challenges in the supply chain, but also with a concentration right now in energy and gas. This, of course, has a geostrategic implications for the US, for Europe, for NATO. And of course, this affects local politics as well. Maybe the only difference for the US, now coming a little bit back to the US, the only difference is that we in the US faced COVID under a Trump administration, the first half of COVID, I would say. I can argue, I don't have the numbers right now with me, but I can say that the main factor that made Trump lose the election was the way he handled the pandemic. But then right now in the current context, we have a different president, President Biden, that has a different approach towards foreign policy. That's the core that we're gonna cover today. Let me see how many minutes I have, because, well, okay, I'm running late. Okay, so let's go to the midterm elections. November 8th. The US voters will choose 35 of 100 senators and more than 400 seats for the House. And what the implications of these, historically, the midterm elections punish, like the result of the midterm elections. Again, historically, this can change eventually, as we have seen changes in the world, but normally punishes the incumbent president, meaning normally presidents don't do well after 2 years of their mandate. And what this would mean for the US is that that the Republicans can have a chance to retake the House of Representatives and also potentially the Senate. And this will change slightly the capacity that the current administration in its next 2 years will have to relate with the Russia, to engage with the Russia conflict, but also to engage with Latin America and others. As we know, this system, the U.S. system, gives a lot of balance, check and balance power to the legislative over the executive power. We're having a very interesting conversation yesterday with some representatives from the External Action Service, and we invited a former U.S. government official who was co-leading, I would say, U.S. policy, foreign policy towards Latin America under Trump administration. And one of the things she said was, if the Republicans win the House, they will, I am sure they will use the oversight power. And what that means is you need to do paperwork to explain Congress what you are doing, and etc. And if you think about this in terms of like how much time can I invest in each of the priorities with all these competing priorities, this of course erodes the capacity that the State Department, the White House, the foreign policy body of the US government have to act to move policy forwards. Another second point important for understanding, I know you guys know this, but domestic politics in the US, domestic politics and how the system works, the way the incentives are put together to influence the policymakers, domestic politics influence directly for US foreign policy. And we see this very clearly. We have a very easy case to pivot to, that is the Florida case, right? In Florida, we have a huge Cuban community. And when I say huge, it's not only about numbers, but about capacity to influence decision-making in Washington, D.C. But right now, more recently, we also see a growing Venezuelan community who also have and are growing in influence in D.C. and in Florida. We have Puerto Ricans, etc. But then we have another case. So it's not what I'm trying to explain here is that the Latino community in the US is not monolithic at all. And it influences in different ways the politics and foreign policy. So we have that reality in Florida, but then we have Mexico. It's a different reality because, sorry, not Mexico. We have Texas. It's a different reality because then you don't have Cubans, Venezuelans, but you might have some, but the majority of the Latino population, there are Mexicans. And then if you go to California, are also Mexicans and people from Central America. So there are different domestic nuances and interests and priorities there that also play. So we cannot, it wouldn't be serious on my end to define that Latinos have this priority when going to the polls, because it's more nuanced, it's very more complex than that. But overall, having said that, thinking about the priorities of the Latinos this is key, because the Latinos that live in the US, and this was something that we found in a poll we conducted last year in Florida, the Latinos that are living in the US have quite different priorities, interests, problems, etc., that their counterparts that are living in Latin America. And that creates a first kind of divorce between what they ask to their policymakers to do regarding the region with what the people that are living in the region perceive as their priorities that mobilize them. So there are this connection that, in my perspective, is not helping to promote constructive, strategic, influential, impactful U.S. relationship with the region. It's preventing the U.S. from having a more nuanced, a more constructive, a more strategic approach, diplomatic approach towards Latin America. And when let me finish, right, by then changing a little bit the scope of the conversation to Latin America itself, right? That again is not monolithic either, but we see kind of a trend happening right now in Latin America. We saw a couple of years ago a race of social discontent expressing in huge protests across the region. We saw that happening in Colombia. We saw that happening in Peru, but also in Chile. A lot of changes are happening in the region, and sometimes we need to again take a step back, get out of the media rush and media frenzy, and try to analyze the situation. And we see that happening 2 years ago. We now see how this quote unquote pink tide is growing in the region, with Pedro Castillo, the leftist Peruvian president, Boric in Chile, Petro in Colombia, surprising results in the first round in Brazil, but with a Lula with potential space to win there. And that also creates an interesting situation for US Latin America relations, as you can imagine. The region also was impacted by COVID. It's also been impacted by the Russia-Ukraine war. The IMF reported 7% of regional economic decline, and that of course touches directly on poverty and inequality that is increasing, and that is the perfect kind of equation for more social discontent and more questioning of the system. So right now also we can maybe think, and maybe this is part of what we're gonna talk after this, after my first phase part. But can we say that in Latin America the societies are also questioning the system, and therefore we're also going through a transformational phase? Should we rethink the way we approach Latin America, Europe and the US approaches Latin America? I think there are a lot of opportunities there, right? We're right now, we have, I would say, a global context that that is fertile for the US and Europe to coordinate in a more intentional way their engagement towards the region. Overall, thinking about the huge challenge that Europe and the US will face in the next 2 years, in the next 2 winters, that is gas and energy. There is space for that to continue, but there is another cool thing, and I am very excited about it, that is that Spain is presiding the European Union next year, the second half of next year. And among their priorities, one of their 3 main priorities is engaging with Latin America. And within the Latin America space, their priority are more around the trade space, prosperity space, kind of to mitigate these economic impacts of these global shocks. So, and I think that by Spain taking a leadership role there, and by the US trying to play a constructive role in the equation, it could be good, beneficial for the three actors. Lastly, again, midterm elections are always I would say dangerous, but midterm elections always challenge the capacity of the governments, of the executive power, to advance foreign policy. On the other hand, there is this another question that was asked yesterday in a meeting that I think is important. Maybe President Biden, we're talking here about political strategy. Maybe President Biden, after the midterm elections and even losing seats in the House and in the Senate and not wanting the re-election, he will be a little bit more aggressive and will take a little bit more risks in terms of foreign policy. So that's another question to be asked. All will depend on the final results, but at the end of the day, the better approach here would be to have a bipartisan approach towards the region. So when the Republicans come to power, you have a continuation of a policy and not these abrupt changes that we have seen, for example, in contrast between Trump presidency and a Biden presidency. I'll end there. I took more than expected. I'm sorry. but we have, I would say 15 minutes for you guys to question, to make your comments, open the floor for you. I'll give the floor to you, Professor, for you to moderate the conversation.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Diego.
Gracias.
Thank you for your brilliant presentation and this broad view on challenge for Latin America. I think we have several questions here. We may have 3 or 4 questions and then you will have time for answering them. If we are having a logistic problem here with the free version of our Zoom, but if it fails, we can reconnect, okay?
Okay.
I would like to ask you about this paradox of that you mentioned, the pandemic left a continent asking for more equality, and this had a room enough for all these presidencies and well, this is the time for the left in Latin America. However, the paradox is that the leftist government has shown their big failures in providing equality, and the Venezuelan case is very clear. So do you think that this is a problem of bad narratives from the center and from the right sides of the spectrum? No, this was my question. Okay, we have okay, we have your name, Armando, Gaston y Horta. Okay, starting with Armando. Come here.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is regarding the Maduro regime in Venezuela and how does the war in Ukraine has affected it, especially given that the US has released sanctions and it has started negotiation talks around prisoners in Venezuela. And I believe that the war in Ukraine has shown as a breath of air to the Maduro regime, and I would like to hear your opinion about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Area, for your talk. It was very interesting. And as you, I'm also from Venezuela. And my name is Gaston, and my question is, I'm doing my thesis on the different attempts of democratic development in Latin America, especially with Kennedy's Alliance for Progress. So I wanted to ask what do you think is the biggest threat to real international democratic cooperation in Latin America? And second, followed by, should the United States have an active role in promoting democratic development in Latin America and take a further step like the Kennedy administration did?
Thank you, Mr. Aria. My question is going to be about Mr. Ron DeSantis and the action that he take with the Venezuelans towards directing them towards Martha's Vineyard. Do you think that this will affect, not Ron DeSantis, because I really think that he will gun the governation, but if this will affect the mindset of the Venezuelans living in Florida that are kind of MAGA or Republicans, you know. So if you think that they are going to reject this position of Mr. Ron DeSantis, or they are in favor of this? Thank you.
What is your name?
Luis. Luis Horta.
Thank you, Luis. Boy. Okay. Okay, thank you for your questions. Interesting. So, Professor, maybe if we compare, like we can, one exercise, one way to solve this paradox is to go back to the Chavez's time, and that pintate, right? Chavez, Fernández, Kirchner's in Argentina, Evo, Correa in Ecuador. They had money, and they had a lot of money. Oil prices were in its peak. Chavez, as you know, conducted a petro foreign policy strategy. So they had resources enough to be able to not be, let's say, balanced in terms of policies, balancing, you know, the fiscal, the expenditures, etc., with, you know, social programs. They weren't so stretched. Their budgets weren't stretched. Right now, we see a quite a different world, right? That's one comment. So it's going to be difficult in my perspective if you see Petro's attempt with the fiscal reform, Petro's attempt to regulate the way they exploit energy to move towards the renewables. He has had to moderate, I would say, or slower his perspective, in contrast with the campaign, of course, because there are fiscal implications of that. And right now, the wiggle room, in my perspective, como el terreno, I mean, the flexibility they have to make mistakes is not big, because again, we're facing a hard economic moment for the region. But on the other hand, and again, I mean, I truly believe that we should evolve from that dichotomy between left and right after like the Second World War como framework, because it's not helpful. And I think right now the debate is autocracy, democracy, should be more towards that. And when I see presidents like President Boric being kind of a leader in promoting respect to human rights, we're not talking about economy, but I think human rights are key to democracy and democratic institutions. And so I see this new left as a potential. I mean, I'm hopeful that this left has the capacity to show not only Latin America, but beyond Latin America, that there is a democratic left that understands how government works and understand that you have an X amount of money and an X amount of challenges, and you need to provide and distribute and be nuanced about how you spend the money of the people, etc. So and that being said, yes, I think there is a narrative, but history backs that narrative that the left historically doesn't do the best job in balancing budgets, in being efficient with public expenditure. Then for Armando, definitely, and I saw this, I experienced, like I saw this happening. The reality is that when Trump was in power, Venezuela was one of the three main priorities for the US in foreign policy. Maybe that's a stretch, maybe the top 5 or 10, let's say the top 10 priorities. But after Trump, that just disappeared. Nobody was talking about Venezuela. Part of my job is to advocate for the Venezuela situation. Nobody wanted to listen. People like, yeah, let's talk tomorrow. Right now, I have an issue I cannot meet, because people weren't prioritizing that. And we saw, it was evident, the abrupt change after Russia-Ukraine happened, after the energy crisis started to be a thing. Of course, let's think about Venezuela as a provider of this energy, because this has a geostrategic implication for the US. And what I want to say here is, and thinking about colonialism and kind of this concept of imperialism, at the end of the day, countries have a national interest, and the national interest is what drives countries, right? But if countries have too much influence over neighbors, over other countries,